The metal walls of Station Omega hummed with the sound of life flowing through its corridors like blood through veins. Deep in the lower levels, where the lights were dim and the air tasted of recycled oxygen and alien sweat, stood a small bar that most beings walked past without noticing. The sign above the door read, "Earth's Rest," in faded blue letters that flickered when the power fluctuated. Inside the bar, Kim Tae-ho wiped down the counter with slow, careful movements. His hands were not large, but they were strong with calluses that spoke of years holding weapons and tools. His black hair was cut short in the military style, though streaks of gray at his temples showed he was no longer young. When he smiled at customers, his dark eyes crinkled at the corners, but there was something deeper there, something that most aliens could not read. The bar was not fancy. 20 stools lined the curved counter, while small tables filled the rest of the space. The lighting was warm and golden, casting shadows that made conversations feel private even when others were listening. Behind the bar shelves held bottles from 100 different worlds containing liquids that could burn through steel or make a Krillin warrior forget his own name. Tonight was like most nights in the lower levels of the station. A mix of species sat scattered around the room, nursing drinks and talking in low voices about trade routes, shipping costs, and the war that everyone pretended not to think about. In one corner, 3 Zenthari merchants argued over a cargo manifest, while at the bar, a lone pilot with blue skin stared into a glass of something that glowed green in the dim light. Tae-ho knew most of his regular customers by name, though few of them knew much about him. To them, he was just another human who had ended up on the edges of civilized space, running a quiet business and keeping to himself. They saw his average height and unremarkable appearance and assumed he was like most. Humans they had met polite but weak, unable to match the physical strength of the galaxy's warrior races. The misconception suited Tae-ho perfectly. He had learned long ago that being underestimated was often more valuable than being feared. People spoke freely around those they considered harmless, and in his 3 years running the bar, he had learned more about galactic politics and military movements than most intelligence officers ever would. The war between Earth and the Galactic Coalition was officially 3 years old, though tensions had been building for much longer. Most aliens believed the human military was weak and disorganized, easily pushed around by the Coalition's superior technology and numbers. The news broadcasts that played on screens throughout the station showed images of human colonies surrendering without fights and Earth's diplomats begging for peace negotiations. What the broadcasts did not show was why the war had started, or what humans were really like when they stopped being polite. Most species in the galaxy had evolved on worlds where strength meant survival, where the biggest and strongest dominated the weak. They understood power that could be seen and measured, the kind that came from thick muscles, sharp claws, or advanced weapons. Humans were different in ways that most aliens could not comprehend. They had evolved as persistence hunters on a world that tried to kill them in new ways every season. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plagues, asteroid impacts, wars that consumed entire continents, none of it had been enough to break them. Instead, each disaster had taught them new lessons about adaptation, cooperation, and the kind of quiet determination that could outlast mountains. Tae-ho understood this better than most humans because he had spent 40 years in Earth's military, rising through the ranks not through political connections or family influence, but through a combination of tactical brilliance and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that had kept humanity alive through 10,000 years of disasters. He had commanded fleets that protected Earth's outer colonies and planned strategies that had saved millions of lives. But that was before the Coalition had made their fatal mistake, before they had decided that humanity's attempts at peaceful negotiation were signs of weakness rather than evidence of wisdom, before they had chosen war over diplomacy and forced Earth's government to make the hardest decision in human history. Now Tae-ho spent his days serving drinks to aliens who thought they understood what humans were capable of. He listened to their Stories about the war, about coalition victories and human retreats, and he said nothing. When customers made jokes about weak humans or cowardly Earth forces, he simply smiled and refilled their glasses. Tonight felt different, though. There was tension in the recycled air, an electric feeling that made conversation quieter than usual. Several customers had already left earlier than normal, and those who remained kept glancing toward the main entrance as if expecting trouble to walk through the door. The feeling was not unfounded. Word had spread through the station's information networks that a coalition military unit was docked at the upper levels. Victory celebrations were common when units returned from successful operations, and those celebrations often spilled down into the lower levels where alcohol was cheaper and questions were fewer. Tai-Ho had heard the rumors and made his preparations. Accordingly, the bottles behind the bar were arranged so he could reach any of them quickly. The emergency communications device was charged and within arm's reach. Most importantly, he had spent an hour that afternoon in quiet meditation, preparing his mind for whatever might come. The meditation was something he had learned during his years as an officer, a way of achieving the kind of mental clarity that allowed split-second decisions in combat situations. To outside observers, it looked like he was simply sitting quietly, but internally, he was reviewing tactical options, calculating probabilities, and preparing for scenarios that ranged from verbal confrontation to lethal violence. When the door finally opened and 5 coalition soldiers walked into his bar, Tai-Ho was ready. He continued polishing glasses with steady hands while his mind cataloged everything about the newcomers, their species, their ranks, their weapons, their apparent level of intoxication, and most importantly, their attitudes. The leader was a Gorlak, nearly 8 feet tall with gray skin like granite and muscles that could crush steel beams. His uniform bore the decorations of a career soldier, someone who had seen combat on dozens of worlds, and survived because he was stronger and more vicious than his enemies. Behind him came 4 others, a mix of species, but all carrying themselves, with the swagger of beings who believed they were the apex predators in any room they entered. Tai-Ho set down his polishing cloth and smiled the kind of polite, welcoming smile that had greeted customers for 3 years. To the watching aliens, it looked like nothing more than a bartender preparing to serve drinks to new customers. They had no way of knowing that they were about to witness the moment when Earth's long game finally began to pay off. The 5 coalition soldiers moved through Tai-Ho's bar like sharks swimming through a reef full of smaller fish. Every alien customer seemed to shrink back instinctively as the warriors passed their table conversations, dropping to whispers or stopping entirely. The Gorlak leader Vex Thor surveyed the room with the cold satisfaction of a predator that had found easy prey. Behind the bar, Tai-Ho continued his work with the same steady calm he had shown for 3 years. His movements were economical and precise as he arranged clean glasses and checked the levels in various bottles. To the watching customers, he appeared completely unaware of the tension that had entered his establishment, but his dark eyes missed nothing. Vex Thor approached the bar with heavy footsteps that made the metal floor plates ring like struck bells. His 3 companions spread out to claim stools, while the 5th, a Vexian with 4 arms and skin like purple leather, positioned himself near the door. The formation was casual, but spoke of long experience working together as a unit. The Gorlak slammed one massive fist onto the bar surface, making bottles rattle and causing several nearby customers to flinch visibly. The sound echoed through the small space like a gunshot, and conversation throughout the room died completely. Every being present turned to stare at the confrontation that was clearly about to unfold. Human Vex Thor barked in the common galactic language, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected instant obedience. Bring us your strongest drinks. We celebrate another victory against your pathetic species. The words hung in the recycled air like poison gas. Every alien in the bar knew that humans and the coalition were at war, but direct taunts like this were unusual even in the lawless lower levels of the station. Most beings tried to avoid political discussions that might lead to violence, especially when military personnel were involved. Tae-ho reached for 5 glasses without hurry or apparent concern. His face showed no reaction to the insult, no flash of anger or fear that might have been expected from a member of a species currently being conquered by the coalition forces. Instead, he simply began pouring drinks with the same professional courtesy he would have shown any customer. The lack of response seemed to irritate Vex-Thor more than anger would have. In the Gorlak warrior culture, strength was demonstrated through dominance, and dominance required visible submission from those who were weaker. A human who showed no fear was either incredibly brave or too stupid to understand the danger he faced. "Your world will burn soon." Little human Vex-Thor continued as he grabbed the glass Tae-ho offered and drained it in a single gulp. The liquid was strong enough to strip paint from metal, but the Gorlak barely seemed to notice. "We have taken 12 of your colonies already. Your people run like frightened children when they see our ships approaching around the bar." Other customers began to shift uncomfortably. Some started gathering their belongings, preparing to leave before the situation escalated further. The Zenthari merchants in the corner whispered among themselves in their own language, while the blue-skinned pilot kept his head down and tried to become invisible. Tae-ho finished pouring the remaining drinks and slid them across the bar to the other soldiers. His expression remained calm and professional, though something subtle had changed in his posture. The change was so slight that only someone trained to read human body language might have noticed it, but it was there like the first tremor before an earthquake. "Will there be anything else?" Tae-ho asked in the same polite tone he had used with thousands of customers over the years. His voice carried no challenge, no fear, no anger, just the simple question of a service worker doing his job. The calm response made Vex-Thor's anger flare hotter. He was accustomed to intimidating beings with his presence alone and the humans. Lack of reaction felt like a personal insult. In his experience, members of weaker species either cowered in terror or tried to appease him with desperate flattery. This quiet indifference was something new and unwelcome. "Did you not hear me?" Human Vex-Thor rose from his stool to his full, impressive height, looming over the bar like a gray mountain of muscle and bone. "I said, your species are cowards. Weak, pathetic, not worthy to share the galaxy with real warriors like us." Still, Tae-ho showed no reaction beyond reaching for another glass to clean. His movements remained as steady as clockwork, while his dark eyes focused on his work with what appeared to be complete attention. But anyone who looked closely might have noticed that his grip on the glass was slightly different. Now his fingers positioned for something other than simple cleaning. The other coalition soldiers watched their leader with interest. They had seen this pattern before Vex-Thor, working himself into a rage that would end with violence and submission from whoever had dared to show him disrespect. It was a ritual they had witnessed on dozens of worlds, and it always ended the same way. At a nearby table, a Vexian trader who had dealt with humans before leaned toward his companion and whispered urgently, "The human is too calm. This is not normal behavior for their kind. When they go still like this, it usually means danger is coming." His warning went unheard by the coalition soldiers who were too focused on their leader's growing fury to pay attention to the worried murmurs of other customers. Vex-Thor had worked himself into the kind of battle rage that had served him well in actual combat. But here in a civilian bar, it was about to make him commit a mistake that would change everything. Fato, Gorlak warrior, had built his reputation on strength and intimidation. Every being he had ever faced had eventually submitted to his superior power either through words or through violence. The idea that this ordinary-looking human bartender might be different never entered his mind. This blindness to possibility was about to cost him everything he had ever valued. His pride, his reputation, his sense of superiority, and ultimately his freedom were all hanging in the balance, though he was too angry to realize it. The human standing calmly behind the bar represented everything Vex Thor despised about weaker species and everything he failed to understand about strength that came from sources other than muscle and bone. Around the room, tension continued to build like pressure in a sealed container approaching its breaking point. The few customers who remained were pressed back against the walls, trying to stay out of the way of whatever explosion was about to occur. Even the station's environmental systems seemed to sense the danger as air circulation slowed and lights flickered uncertainly. Tejo set down the glass he had been cleaning and looked directly into Vex Thor's red eyes for the first time since the soldiers had entered his bar. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but somehow carried clearly through the tense silence that filled the room. "I think you have had enough to drink. Perhaps you should leave." The words were spoken without threat or anger. Just a simple suggestion from a business owner to a customer who was causing problems. But in the context of everything that had been said, they carried the weight of a direct challenge to Vex Thor's authority and dignity. The silence that followed was complete and absolute. Every being in the bar understood that they had just witnessed the moment when talking ended and action began. What none of them could have predicted was how quickly and decisively that action would unfold, or how completely it would shatter their understanding of what humans were really capable of when their patience finally ran out. The air in Earth's rest became thick and heavy like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks open the sky. Every being in the bar understood that violence was about to explode in the small space, but none of them could move away fast enough to avoid being caught in whatever was about to happen. The tension was so strong it seemed to make the metal walls themselves hold their breath. Vex Thor stared down at the human bartender with eyes that burned like red coals in his granite face. In all his years as a coalition warrior, he had never encountered such blatant disrespect from a member of what he considered an inferior species. The suggestion that he should leave was not just an insult. It was a challenge to everything he believed about power and dominance in the galaxy. The other coalition soldiers shifted on their stools, watching their leader with the kind of attention that veteran fighters develop when they sense combat is about to begin. They had seen Vex Thor in this state before the controlled fury that preceded explosive violence. Usually it ended with broken bones and cowering submission from whoever had been foolish enough to provoke him. Around the room, the remaining customers pressed themselves against walls and behind furniture, trying to create as much distance as possible between themselves and the confrontation at the bar. The Zenthari merchants had abandoned their trade discussion entirely, while the blue-skinned pilot gripped his glass so tightly his knuckles had turned white with strain. Tejo stood behind his bar with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the encounter. His hands rested lightly on the polished surface within easy reach of glasses, bottles, and anything else he might need. To the watching aliens, he appeared completely unaware of the danger building in front of him, but his dark eyes held a quality of alertness that suggested otherwise. "Stand still when your betters speak to you!" Vex Thor roared with a voice like grinding stone that echoed off the metal walls and made glasses vibrate on their shelves. The sound was so loud and violent that several customers near the door finally broke and ran for the exit, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. The massive Gorlak reached across the bar with one hand, intending to grab the human by his simple work shirt and drag him close enough to deliver a lesson about showing proper respect to superior beings. His fingers were thick as steel cables and strong enough to crush bone, but they closed on empty air as Tejo stepped back just far enough to avoid the grasp. The failure to make contact only increased Vex Thor's rage. No one had ever successfully avoided his reach before, and the idea that this small, unremarkable human could do so was beyond his understanding. His warrior pride demanded immediate and violent correction of this impossible situation. "I think you have had enough to drink," Tejo repeated in the same quiet, reasonable tone that had started this confrontation. "Perhaps you should leave before this gets worse for everyone." The calm suggestion delivered in such ordinary circumstances would have been perfectly reasonable. but spoken to a Gorlak war hero in front of his subordinates and a room full of witnesses, it was the equivalent of declaring war. Vex Thor's entire identity was built on being the strongest, most feared warrior in any room, and having a human bartender suggest otherwise was unacceptable. What happened next would be remembered and retold in bars across the galaxy for years to come. Vex Thor drew back his massive hand and swung it in a vicious backhand slap aimed directly at Taeho's face. The blow carried enough force to shatter bones and had been known to kill smaller beings outright. It was meant to be a lesson about the price of disrespecting those who commanded respect through strength. But something impossible occurred in the space between the start of the swing and its intended target. Taeho's hand moved with fluid precision, intercepting the Gorlak's wrist just inches from his face. His fingers closed around the massive arm with casual ease as if he were catching a thrown ball instead of stopping an attack that could have killed him. Vex Thor's eyes widened in shock as he found himself frozen mid-swing, unable to complete the motion that should have ended this confrontation decisively. He tried to push forward with all his strength, putting every ounce of his considerable muscle behind the strike, but the human's grip was immovable, as if his wrist had been caught in a steel trap. The silence in the bar became absolute. Every customer, every soldier, every being present stared at the impossible scene playing out before them. A human who should have been no match for a Gorlak warrior was holding the massive alien effortlessly, despite the obvious difference in their size and apparent strength. Vex Thor tried to pull back to free his arm from the human's grasp, but found that impossible as well. No matter how he twisted or strained, he could not break free from fingers that looked ordinary, but held him with the strength of industrial machinery. Sweat began to bead on his gray forehead as he realized he was completely helpless. I asked. "You nicely to leave," Taeho said in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather. "Now, I am telling you." The words were spoken without anger or threat, just a simple statement of fact that somehow carried more menace than all of Vex Thor's shouting had managed. The human's dark eyes held no emotion beyond mild irritation, as if dealing with unruly customers was just another part of his job. Around the bar, the other coalition soldiers started to rise from their stools, reaching instinctively for weapons, but they froze when they saw their legendary leader held helpless by a being they had considered weak and insignificant. The sight was so impossible that their minds struggled to process what they were seeing. The Vexian trader, who had warned his companion about human behavior, watched with fascination as his predictions came true. He had dealt with humans before in commercial settings and had learned to recognize the signs that preceded their rare displays of actual capability. Most species showed their strength openly, but humans seemed to prefer hiding their true nature until circumstances forced them to reveal it. What none of the aliens in the bar understood was that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple barroom confrontation. Taeho was not just a human bartender defending himself against an aggressive customer. He was a representative of his species, showing the galaxy what happened when humanity's patience finally reached its limits. The grip around Vex Thor's wrist began to tighten with slow, inexorable pressure. The sound of bones grinding against each other filled the silent room as the mighty Gorlak warrior who had conquered planets and crushed armies began to realize that he had made the greatest mistake of his life. For the first time in his long career as a soldier, Vex Thor understood what it felt like to be completely powerless in the hands of someone stronger. The experience was terrifying in ways he had never imagined, and it was about to teach him lessons about humanity that would change everything he thought he knew about the war his people were fighting. The slap that was meant to put an insolent human in his place had instead sealed the fate of everyone in the room and possibly everyone in the galaxy. What happened next would depend entirely on how quickly the coalition soldiers learned to see humans as something other than weak prey to be hunted and conquered. The sound that came from Vex Thor's throat was unlike anything the other beings in the bar had ever heard from a Gorlak warrior. It started as a growl of frustrated rage, but quickly transformed into something closer to a whimper of pain as Tae-ho's grip continued to tighten around his wrist with mechanical precision. The bones in the massive alien's arm ground against each other with sounds like breaking stone. Behind their leader, the other coalition soldiers finally overcame their shock, enough to reach for their weapons. Plasma pistols and neural disruptors appeared in hands that trembled slightly with adrenaline and disbelief, but they hesitated to fire with their commander held so close to their target, and that hesitation gave Tae-ho time to speak again. "Let me tell you something about humans," he said in the same conversational tone he might use to explain a drink recipe to a curious customer. "We are not the weakest species in the galaxy. We are just the most polite. We try to solve problems with words first, because we have learned what happens when we do not." The casual way he delivered this information, while casually crushing the wrist of one of the galaxy's most feared warriors, made the words even more chilling. Vexthor continued to struggle against the iron grip, but his efforts were becoming weaker as pain overwhelmed his ability to think clearly. "You see," Tae-ho continued as if giving a lecture to students, "Earth did not start this war. Your coalition decided that our colonies looked easy to take. You thought we would surrender without a fight because we tried to negotiate first. You mistook our patience for weakness." He paused to look around the room at the faces watching him with mixtures of fascination and terror. Some customers had pressed themselves so far back against the walls they seemed to be trying to merge with the metal panels. Others stared with the kind of horrified attention that people give to disasters they cannot look away from. "The thing about humans is that we do not just fight with our bodies," Tae-ho explained patiently. "We fight with our minds, our tools, and our refusal to give up. Every human child learns about Earth's history, about how our ancestors survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and disasters that would have wiped out most species." Vexthor's struggles were growing, more desperate as he began to understand that raw strength would not free him from this impossible situation. All his life he had been the strongest being in any confrontation, the one who others feared and submitted to. Now he was learning what helplessness felt like, and the lesson was more terrifying than any battle he had ever fought. "We survived because we are adaptable." Tae-ho continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a teacher sharing important knowledge. "Because we never give up, and because when you really threaten us, we become something you do not want to face." The pressure around Vexthor's wrist increased again, and this time, the sound of breaking bone was clearly audible throughout the bar. The mighty Gorlak warrior let out a howl of agony that echoed through the corridors beyond, and brought running footsteps from station security personnel who were still several minutes away. "Your news reports say you are winning that human colonies are falling," Tae-ho said, as if the sounds of pain coming from his prisoner were just background noise. "That is true, but it is not the whole truth." With his free hand, he reached under the bar and withdrew a small communication device. The coalition soldiers tensed, expecting a weapon, but relaxed slightly when they saw it was just standard civilian technology. What they did not know was that this particular device contained information that would change their understanding of everything they thought they knew about the war. "Every colony your forces have taken was evacuated before you arrived," Tae-ho activated the device, and a three-dimensional holographic display appeared in the air above the bar, showing star charts marked with battle sites, fleet movements, and supply routes. "Every battle you have won was actually a retreat we planned." The aliens in the room leaned forward to see the display better, their eyes widening as they began to comprehend what they were looking at. The charts showed a pattern that was invisible to individual commanders, but obvious when viewed from a strategic perspective. Every coalition victory had drawn their forces deeper into human space, stretching supply lines and exposing weaknesses. "We have been drawing your fleets away from your home worlds," Tae-ho explained, pointing to different areas of the display with his free hand while maintaining his iron grip on Vexthor with the other. Making you think you are unstoppable while we study everything about how you fight. Vexthor stared at the holographic charts with growing horror as he recognized battle sites where he had personally led coalition forces to what he had believed were glorious victories. Now he could see them differently, as moves in a vast game of strategy that he had not even known he was playing. 3 years ago, Earth's government made a decision. Taeho continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. We could fight you at our borders and maybe win eventually, or we could let you come to us, learn everything about your tactics and technology, then end this war in a way you would never forget. The hologram shifted to show massive construction sites, hidden in asteroid fields and behind gas giant moons. Thousands of human warships hung in space like sleeping giants, their designs clearly based on captured coalition technology, but improved in ways that made them look almost organic in their deadly beauty. Every piece of equipment you brought into our space has been studied and copied, Taeho said quietly. Every tactical mistake you made has been recorded and analyzed. We know exactly how you fight what you fear and where you are vulnerable. The revelation hit the coalition soldiers like physical blows. Everything they had believed about their superiority, their inevitable victory, their understanding of human capabilities had just been revealed as carefully constructed illusions. They had been playing a game where only one side knew the real rules. The holographic display showed more than just ships and battle plans. It revealed the true scope of human industrial capacity populations that had been hidden or relocated entire. Star systems that had been disguised to look uninhabited while serving as massive military production centers. Your leaders think they are fighting a small, weak species with limited resources, Taeho explained as new sections of the display revealed the true extent of human civilization. They do not know that we have been preparing for this war for 50 years since we first made contact with the coalition and learned what kind of beings you really are. Station security finally arrived at the bar entrance, but stopped when they saw the scene inside. Their leader, a Zenthari named HFY, looked around in confusion at what appeared to be a military briefing being conducted by a human bartender who was casually holding a Gorlak war hero prisoner with one hand. "What is happening here, HFY?" asked his translator caller, converting his clicking speech into common galactic language. Taeho smiled politely without releasing his grip on Vexthor's increasingly damaged wrist. "Just a small disagreement about the war. I think these gentlemen were about to leave. But before they could leave, there was one more revelation that would complete their understanding of just how badly they had misjudged both the war and the being, who was teaching them these painful lessons about the true nature of human patience and capability." The security team leader, HFY, looked around the bar with growing confusion as he tried to understand what kind of situation he had walked into. His training had prepared him for typical bar fights, broken furniture, injured customers, and maybe some property damage. Instead, he found what looked like a military strategy session being conducted by a human bartender who was somehow holding a Gorlak warrior captive with apparent ease. The holographic display still floated above the bar, showing detailed star charts, fleet positions, and tactical analyses that would have been classified at the highest levels of any military organization. The information was so sensitive that merely viewing it without proper authorization would have been considered an act of treason in most civilized systems. Taeho shut off the display with a casual gesture, but kept his grip firmly locked around Vexthor's broken wrist. The Gorlak had stopped struggling and now hung from the human's grasp like a puppet with cut strings, his face gray with pain and shock. The transformation from arrogant warrior to helpless prisoner had taken less than 5 minutes. Just a small disagreement about the war, Taeho repeated to the security chief with the kind of polite smile that customer service workers perfected after years of dealing with difficult people. "I think these gentlemen were about to leave," but even as he spoke, everyone in the room could sense that something more was coming. The casual way the human had revealed military secrets suggested that he had authorization to share information that should have been impossible for a civilian bartender to possess. The implications were staggering and terrifying. "The fleet will move tomorrow," Tae-ho said conversationally, as if discussing plans for repainting his bar rather than revealing what appeared to be the timing of a major military operation. "Earth's patience has finally run out. Your coalition will learn what happens when you mistake our kindness for weakness." He began cleaning another glass with his free hand, his movements as calm and practiced as ever, despite the fact that he was holding a 200-pound warrior prisoner while discussing classified military operations. The contradiction between his ordinary appearance and his extraordinary capabilities was becoming impossible to ignore. "The war will be over in 6 months. Tae-ho continued, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the future and knew exactly how events would unfold. "Your leaders will surrender unconditionally, and every world you have conquered will be returned to its people. The only question is how many of your soldiers will survive to see it happen." Vex Thor finally found his voice, though it came out as barely, a whisper through lips that had gone pale with pain and shock. How he managed to ask, "How do I know you are telling the truth?" The question hung in the recycled air of the bar like smoke from a fire that everyone could smell, but no one could see. Around the room, alien customers and coalition soldiers waited for an answer that would either confirm their worst fears or reveal this entire display as an elaborate bluff. Tae-ho looked up from his glass cleaning and smiled. It was not a cruel expression or angry or threatening in any way. Instead, it carried the patient warmth of someone who understood exactly what was happening and felt genuine sympathy for those who were about to learn painful truths about the universe they thought they understood. Because he said quietly, "I am not just a bartender." The words were spoken so simply that their meaning took several seconds to register with his audience. When understanding finally dawned, the effect was like watching a building collapse in slow motion as each listener realized the implications of what they had just heard. "I am Kim Tae-ho, former Admiral of Earth's Third Fleet." Tae-ho continued as he set down the glass and picked up another one to clean. "I was the one who planned this entire strategy. The retreats, the sacrificed colonies, the intelligence gathering. Everything your forces thought were victories were actually moves in a game I designed 3 years ago." The revelation hit the coalition soldiers like a physical assault. They had not just threatened and attacked a human bartender, they had confronted one of Earth's top military commanders without knowing it. The man they had considered weak and insignificant was actually one of the architects of what appeared to be their species' doom. "And tomorrow I go back to my real job," Tae-ho added with the kind of casual understatement that made the words even more chilling. "This bar, this identity, this entire life I have been living for 3 years was just part of my cover while I gathered intelligence on coalition operations in this sector Keth Va." The security chief found himself backing toward the door as the magnitude of what he was witnessing became clear. He was not just observing a bar fight or even a diplomatic incident. He was watching the moment when one of the galaxy's most classified military operations was revealed to enemy soldiers and civilian witnesses. The other customers in the bar began to understand that they had stumbled into something far beyond their comprehension. They had thought they were just drinking in a quiet establishment in the lower levels of a space station. But instead, they had become witnesses to what might be the turning point of an interstellar war. "Your slap," Tae-ho said to Vex Thor, his voice carrying a note of genuine regret, "was indeed the last move you ever made as a free warrior. Tomorrow when our fleets arrive at your worlds, remember this moment. Remember that a human gave you every chance to walk away in peace." The broken Gorlak stared at the being who had destroyed everything he believed about strength, power, and victory with nothing more than superior knowledge and the kind of patient planning that his warrior culture had never learned to appreciate. The lesson was more devastating than any physical defeat could have been. Around the room, the witnesses to this impossible scene began to realize that they were going to remember this night for the rest of their lives. They had seen the moment when humanity finally revealed its true nature, and the galaxy would never be the same again. But there was still one more surprise waiting, a final revelation that would complete their understanding of just how thoroughly they had all been outmaneuvered by a species they had dismissed as weak and insignificant. The human bartender who had just crushed a warrior's bones and revealed himself as a military commander was about to show them that even this was not the full extent of what Earth had planned for its enemies. The silence that followed Taeho's revelation stretched across the bar like a heavy blanket that muffled sound and made breathing difficult. Every being present understood that they had witnessed something that would change the course of galactic history, but none of them fully comprehended the magnitude of what was about to unfold across the stars. Vexthor hung from the human's grip like a broken doll, his massive frame somehow diminished by the knowledge that everything he had believed about his own superiority was built on lies and misconceptions. The warrior who had conquered planets and crushed armies now looked like nothing more than a child who had discovered that the monsters under his bed were real after all. Behind their leader, the other coalition soldiers stood frozen in positions of half-drawn weapons and incomplete thoughts. Their training had prepared them for many scenarios, but none of their instructors had ever explained what to do when confronting an enemy who had been playing a completely different game with rules they had never learned to understand. The security chief Kethva remained near the door with his own weapon holstered, but his hand resting nervously on its grip. As station security, his job was to maintain order and prevent violence, but the situation he had walked into was so far beyond normal parameters that his protocols offered no guidance for how to proceed. Around the room, the civilian customers pressed themselves against walls and furniture with the kind of terrified fascination that made people watch natural disasters unfold. They knew they were witnessing history in the making, but they also understood that being too close to such events often meant becoming casualties rather than just observers. Taeho finally released his grip on Vexthor's shattered wrist, and the massive Gorlak stumbled backward, clutching his injured arm against his chest. The broken bones ground together with every movement, sending waves of agony through his system. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological devastation of learning how completely he had been outmaneuvered. "You want to know something else about humans?" Taeho said as he reached under the bar again, this time withdrawing what looked like a standard communication device, but was clearly something much more sophisticated. "We do not just plan for victory. We plan for what comes after victory." He activated the device, and new holographic displays filled the air above the bar, but these were different from the military charts he had shown before. Instead, they showed detailed plans for post-war reconstruction, refugee resettlement programs, and economic recovery initiatives that covered hundreds of worlds. "When your coalition surrenders, and it will surrender," Taeho explained as he gestured toward different sections of the display. "We will not enslave your peoples or destroy your worlds. We will help you rebuild into something better than what you were before." This war started. The revelation was almost more shocking than learning about Earth's hidden military capabilities. Most species in the galaxy understood conquest as a process of domination and exploitation, where the winners took everything of value and left the losers to survive as best they could. The idea that humans would actually help their enemies recover was beyond comprehension. Your leaders started this war because they believed strength meant taking what others had built. Taeho continued, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher explaining basic concepts to confused students. But humans learned long ago that real strength means building something better than what existed before. Vexthor stared at the holographic reconstruction plans with growing bewilderment. His entire worldview was built on the idea that the strong dominated the weak, and that victory meant crushing your enemies so completely they could never threaten you again. The concept of helping defeated enemies rebuild was so alien to his thinking that he struggled to process it. "We have been preparing for peace as carefully as we prepared for war," Taeho explained as new sections of the display showed detailed cultural exchange programs, educational initiatives, and technology sharing agreements. "Because we know that lasting victory does not come from defeating your enemies, It comes from turning them into friends. The coalition soldiers exchanged glances of confusion and growing panic as they began to understand that they were not just facing military defeat, but complete ideological transformation. Everything they had been taught about power, strength, and survival was being revealed as primitive and outdated thinking. Around the bar, the alien customers began to whisper among themselves as they realized what they were seeing. The humans were not just planning to win the war. They were planning to fundamentally change how the entire galaxy thought about conflict and cooperation. The implications were staggering for every species and every government in known space. "Tomorrow our fleets will begin the final phase of operations," Tejo said, as he shut off the holographic displays and returned the communication device to its place under the bar. "Within 6 months, your coalition will no longer exist as a military force. But within 10 years, the worlds that were part of it will be more prosperous and peaceful than they have ever been." He began cleaning glasses again, his movements as calm and methodical as they had been throughout the entire confrontation. To watching observers, it seemed impossible that someone could discuss the end of an interstellar war with the same casual attention they gave to routine bar maintenance. The human looked around the room at the faces staring at him with mixtures of awe, fear, and confused hope. Some of the aliens were beginning to understand that what they had witnessed was not just the revelation of military secrets, but a glimpse of a completely different way of thinking about power and civilization. "Your slap Tejo," said to Vex Thor. "One final time was the last move you made as a warrior of the old galaxy. Tomorrow you become something new, whether you want to or not. The only choice you have left is whether you learn to be better than what you were." The broken Gorlak tried to speak, but no words came out. Everything he had valued, everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, had been swept away in the space of 30 minutes by a human bartender who had turned out to be an admiral philosopher and architect of galactic transformation, all rolled into one ordinary-looking package. Station security finally moved to escort the coalition soldiers away from the bar, but their actions were gentle, almost respectful, as if they understood they were dealing with beings who had just learned that their entire universe was about to change in ways they could not yet comprehend. As the soldiers were led away, Vex Thor managed one last look back at the human who had destroyed his world with nothing more than superior planning patience and an understanding of strength that went far beyond physical force. The lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life, assuming he lived long enough to see the new galaxy that humanity was about to create. Tejo returned to cleaning glasses, humming quietly to himself, as if nothing unusual had happened. Tomorrow he would put on his admiral's uniform and lead the largest fleet in human history to victory, but tonight he was content to serve drinks to anyone who wanted them, human or alien alike. After all, that was what humans did. They were patient. They were kind, and they gave everyone a chance to do the right thing. But when that patience finally ran out, they made sure it was the last mistake their enemies ever made. And then they helped those former enemies build something better than either side had imagined possible. The war that the coalition thought they were winning had been over before it began. The humans had just been polite, enough to let their enemies think otherwise right up until the moment they decided to end it. And now the real work of building a better galaxy could finally begin.